All right. So, welcome, Sujay and Ushma. We are delighted to have you with us in the Metaforum in this webinar. As we were saying before we started, both John and me were absolutely delighted to your presentation in Oxford in the WASC conference. And we thought that it will be a really nice opportunity to give other people from the Metaforum who didn't come to Oxford the opportunity to get to know your ideas. So this is really nice to see you. So I will invite you to introduce yourselves briefly if you want and start the webinar. We have agreed that you will have your presentation, and after the presentation, we'll take questions. Okay, so please, it's all yours.
Right. Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much. First of all, it's quite a privilege to be here on Metaforum. I remember several years ago when I was trying to teach myself the VSM, one of the first websites that I encountered was Metaforum. So it was, I think, in a more basic form then. But it's really nice, quite a privilege to be presenting here after that. Right. So this is for the benefit of some people who may not be aware. This is a continuation of a presentation done in the WASC conference late last year. It was a more brief presentation in Oxford, but hopefully some progress on that presentation. For us, the last several months has been a lot of amplification of variety. We've been really confused with what we're trying to say, and been really trying to make things very clear to ourselves on what exactly we were trying to say. And I think it's on the path to recovery in some sense, but let's see, and really looking forward to the feedback from this session. So I'd like to start with, instead of a formal introduction, more of who are the people involved here and where do we come from. So my name is Sujay, and I would say I'm mainly attracted to the cybernetic discipline, and I see myself as a researcher and a consultant. And my main concern is the idea behind this presentation, which is the critical organizational praxis. Ushma, who's also here, who will be co-presenting with me, comes from an organization development background. She is passionate about practice and about helping people, develop agency in their operational environments. There's another person who's more recently been involved in these sort of conversations, and he's not going to be joining us today. He is a forest ecologist who is, again, a field person who's interested in community forestry and ecological restoration. He runs a nonprofit called Forestry for All Foundation, for which I happen to be one of the advisors. And his concern is ethnobotanical practices, or indigenous ecological practices, and the idea of doing without science. This is something that, this is an idea that comes about in Andrew Pickering's work, and so this is where we're coming from. And what's common between the three of us is our experiences with all types of organizations in India. And all of us have, variously been consultants, managers, entrepreneurs, or facilitators. And we found that there are a number of things related to the organization in India, whether it is formally defined or more loosely defined. And we seem to find some patterns that are across our experiences, and so we are really interested in how can we intervene effectively given that we understand challenges in a certain way, and then who really are we to intervene, and what is our role as interveners? So I think this is maybe a more operational introduction to this presentation. So we are really concerned about the organization in India, and so the question of why the framing of a critical organizational praxis is we see that the organization is in crisis, and all our experiences have pointed to fragmentation within the organization, which gives rise to a lot of stress to the more disadvantaged members of the organization. And there are communication breakdowns, there's a lot of mistrust and so on. And a lot of this seems to be reflected in larger society, and the divide seems to be between the social elite, who are also the organizational elite more often than not, and the social non-elite. And there is a divide between the English language, the usage of the English language in professional and in governance domains, and vernacular. And India, as I'm sure a lot of you know, has a number of languages that are spoken across the country, some prominently, some not so prominently, but we do have a huge diversity of languages. And then again, there's a divide between mainstream management education, what is typically taught in elite business schools and in the country, and the tacit knowledge that may exist within communities and groups of people, and also indigenous practices, both traditional and local. And these people at two ends of the chasm are often at a loss to deal with definitions or meanings of things like organization or role or work or performance. These people have, these groups have different meanings that they ascribe to these things. So also the values are different, because we are talking about people from different cultural backgrounds and different ontologies, so to speak. So this is the context of what we're talking about, and we see that the organization reflects larger social phenomena like social divisions and oppression in society. At the same time, the organization is also a venue and a motif for change. So an organization is a place where simulations of equitable behavior are possible. For example, in a certain cultural context, men and women may not be very comfortable working together in a non-organizational context, but thrown into an organization, to some extent, they are able to work together. And this is not, common across all of India, but there are places where gender, and man-woman relations are not as straightforward as they may be in an urban context. And also, organizations are places where new language and metaphor are discovered, and obviously the impact of robust organizations on livelihoods, ecology, economy, and so on are also there. So before we get into a look at some of the phenomena and how we're trying to frame this and make sense of it, some of the main sources and inspiration for this line of thinking, organization cybernetics is where I've spent most of the last few years have been spent largely in the domain of organizational cybernetics, mainly in consulting with both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. Critical systems thinking, especially having experienced coercive contexts and power imbalances in the course of my experience. Critical management studies, which talks largely about decolonization, post-colonial society, and the idea of indigenous, with a capital I. And then the ideas of Freire, critical pedagogy, especially ideas of dialogue, problematization, and the raising of a critical consciousness. Finally, I must thank Raul for introducing me to the newer work of Pickering, which talks about the idea of enframing and poiesis. To put it simply, enframing is in Pickering's discourse. It is the concept of acting on nature, where where the human being is seen as a dominating force, and nature is something to be controlled. And poiesis is acting with nature. Of course, our interpretation of poiesis and enframing is slightly is colored slightly differently in the context that we're talking about. And finally, the ideas of Krippendorf, critical cybernetics, also is very important to this line of thinking, and we will encounter some of these things later. So this is the kind of roughly the path, the meandering path to our presentation. Now, some of the features that we've observed in organizations, and some of this is supported by data, some of this by anecdotes, some of this by narrative analysis. We've put them into critical perspectives and cybernetic perspectives. Now, one of the features of the Indian organization is that there is an ontological variety. So there are, first of all, people who attach different meanings to things like work, task, hierarchy, skill, and so on. And they are not the same. And people have to constantly renegotiate these things. Often they are in contrast, and they are in opposition to each other. While we may talk about a recursive organizational membership, the organization memberships also tend to be quite complex, because often it appears that the primary membership is not to the work or the activity-based organization, but to a different organization. And how do you understand that with relation to alignment of purpose or trying to create a robust organizational system? So, and then there's the idea of internal colonization, which Banerjee speaks about, which is basically what happens in a post-colonial society when which is not dealt with decolonization as a theme. So some of the native elites in the colonized period, they inherit privilege, and along with that, there is epistemic hierarchies that may be formed. A simple example is the dominance of, say, the English language in work in India, and also the social hierarchy, in which the English language is placed higher than, say, a regional language or a vernacular. So this is implicit, and this features in this comes across in metaphors that of common language the language that people use, and so the sort of this is something that's common, and it expresses itself in a variety of ways. And there's a blindness to indigenous systems, and there's a complete lack of knowledge, and we've seen that indigenous practices and knowledge are fast depleting in several critical areas, especially those related to ecology and in areas which are climate change sensitive. So these are some of the phenomena that we've observed from a critical point of view. From a cybernetic point of view, several of the archetypes that are explained in Espejo and Rey's work can be seen. These are just some examples, but a number of archetypes are commonly seen. Now, there is evidently a historicity in the organizations. Any organization, there is a historicity that is playing out, and it might be, going back to social divisions and caste and the colonial past, which are now manifest in a totally different way, maybe in terms of internal colonialism, epistemological hierarchies, or in an inframing, in Pickering sense, but also not just an acting on nature, but also an acting on people, or an acting without people. So a blindness to certain ways of living, or certain ways of doing and thinking, and often enframing of resources and enframing of nature happens as a second order effect of enframing of people. It is from here that we are envisioning a critical praxis, which through emergent behaviors can reconstitute itself, which has the presence of dialogue, and where there is some sort of a balance between enframing and poiesis at different levels, and where we can actually talk about things like emancipation. So this is, an ideal that this sort of a effort endeavors towards. Finally, a note on indigenous knowledge. Now, indigenous knowledge, the way we think of it, might emerge from critical practices. Okay, it might emerge from critical practice on ground, and this is what we call indigenous with a small I. There could also be traditional practices which are passed down. There is an ancestrality to them, and these are what we call indigenous with a capital I. However, I think that language to understand the indigenous is equally important in cybernetics. The way we see it has a role to play there, because we have to recognize activity that is poetic in nature, or sympoiesis, which is a word that Krippendorf uses, which is producing width, right? So we are interested in indigenous knowledge when it comes to not just ecological practices, but also people practices, indigenous ways of people working together, indigenous ways of community, indigenous ways of community problem solving, which we know exists in this country. Right? So this is what we feel about the indigenous, but it also comes with certain caveats. It is very easy for especially the indigenous with a capital I to be co-opted into dominant political narratives, and resulting in basically the replacement of one dominant epistemology with another. This is possible when there is, mainstream religions have a tendency to do things like that. And also co-opting into dominant narratives, based on convenience. So this is something that we must watch out for. We must also look at what really is indigenous, and how do we understand indigenous practices. So the theoretical development of this is as you can see, is a work in progress. This is a fairly simplistic view of how we approach it, but three main areas we are concerned with are cybernetics in the understanding that cybernetics is concerned fundamentally with effective action, critical perspectives concerned with justice, and we're interested in dialogic or facilitative practices, much in the lines of what Freire has spoken about, and this is in order to ensure the agency of actors, and these actors may be human or non-human actors in terms of rivers and mountains and forests and so on. So we feel that the critical organizational praxis lies at the intersection of these ways of thinking. However, moving forward, I wonder if the critical organizational praxis is something very similar to Krippendorf's critical cybernetics, because the focus of the cybernetic agenda within this praxis is the recognition of agents or stakeholders, many of whom may not know that they are stakeholders, and recognizing the ontological and epistemological diversity that might exist among these stakeholders, recognizing activity that is poetic in nature or sympoietic in nature, and its performance criteria is not in creating in the immediate or in the proximal say, a viable system, but in enhancing dialogue. So dialogue becomes the performance criteria. And we are interested in dialogue with different stakeholders or agents and different systems of different epistemic systems and different practices and so on. And the idea is to start small and try to build consensus outwards in trying to have a common ground across different kinds of stakeholders and focusing on what emerges. And often what we're interested in, what emerges is we're interested in language and metaphor that emerges from dialogue. And we are really interested in problematization and the highlighting of pathologies, especially when it comes to underrepresented or disadvantaged groups of people. And avoiding what I think I've slightly cheekily coined as epistemological runoffs. What I mean here is that in the space of intervention, it is not very beneficial to run into the depths of an epistemological system and in the process disenfranchise a number of people. So to try to include and try to look at a language that unites instead of a language that is restricted to experts in any domain. So this is very swiftly and briefly the direction that we're looking at. And what does this mean in practice? Today, what does this mean? It means improving dialogue with the elite and those in power. The elite belong to a certain, the groups of the elite groups, we can say that there is a certain ontology within which they operate. They look at the world in a certain way. Often they may not know that they look at the world in that way. And so the task of the cybernetic dialogue here is to humanize the organization or contextualize the organization, even though in the short term it might be for the elite to look at their own interests, to understand how longer term thinking might benefit them and their interests, but to still develop a dialogue. A new language to include more ideas in policy making from different contextual elements. And then a cybernetic dialogue with the indigenous, primarily in foregrounding what is indigenous, and in building new language and metaphor for emancipation and also to increase representation of different groups. And also dialogue with mainstream epistemologies, which means grappling with the themes of a certain societal context. So situated discussions on various themes, decolonization, values, social relations, the idea of democracy, and so on. Basically building reflexivity in epistemological systems. So this is what it is in terms of the conceptual aspect. And I think I would like to now hand over to Ushma, who will dwell into practice, into how some of these things, how are we trying to embody these ideas in practice. And then we'll do a little bit of back and forth, and then we will open the floor for questions.
Right. Thanks, Sujay, for setting the context and also giving the conceptual view of what critical organization practices is. First of all, thank you for having me here. Very excited to see some familiar faces that we met in Oxford. So just a little bit of introduction and where I come from. As a professional, I identify as an organization development professional. And it was in my OD course that I was introduced to Stafford Beer's work, that is VSM. And I'm equally delighted to see some of my batchmates from my post-graduation journey to be here. And I'm quite thankful to be talking here along with my OD batchmates. So Yes, as Sujay said, I'll be talking more from the ground, the field notes from the ground. There may be a bit of theory, but more of it comes from what I have seen, what I have experienced. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study that we did. So to give more brief about how organization development consulting works is that it is generally OD consultants are engaged in an organization by critical members of the organization who are in position of power. So their position itself is that of an authority. And when we come in the organization fabric, we are introduced with various challenges as viewed by the organization elite, as what Sujay mentioned. Now, when these problem statements are presented to an OD consultant, the work of an OD consultant is actually to uncover the narratives and what is actually the reality in the organization. So it is it's a balance of those in position of power and those on whom the power is, or you can say the oppressed and the oppressor. So it is a delicate balance which comes into play. So this is one of the identities with which an OD consultant enters in the system. And with that context, I would like to just talk about practical experience that we had. Sujay, if you can move to the next slide of having a dialogue. Yeah. So the organization over here was or rather is based in India, and it had geographically distributed service operations. So when I say geographically distributed, means in India, there are metro cities like Bangalore, Mumbai, New Delhi, where we find a lot of focus of elite organization members, as what Sujay mentioned, those who are educated in English language, who come from educational institutes which continue to teach management practices which are from the West. And this particular organization had its centers in the rural part of India. Now, the characteristic of these rural centers was that English was not a language which was commonly used. The languages here were Kannada, Tamil, Marathi, and so people would think in vernacular language, and even if we are to talk with them, there would be an internal translation which would happen. Hence, it would become a little difficult to really capture what the challenges are. So when we actually started connecting with the leadership, as I mentioned at the start of the conversation, that the leadership engaged us and they gave us the challenges which were on the face, which were like the managers are incapable and they need to have management development programs. There are communication gaps, so do something about it. And another challenge was there is no growth. So the organization is not growing the way they would want the organization to grow. Now, these were the presented statements, as we call in organization development, client presenting statements. So now the main task was not to really uncover as the epistemologies or what was actually happening on the ground, which led to these phenomena, such as incapable managers, communication gaps, stagnant growth, etc. We started with a very simple approach, not as an expert who knows it all, It wasn't that, okay, this is the communication challenge and this is the solution, or managers are incapable, let's put them into a leadership development program. None of it. We went with a very open mind, and we spoke with with a cross section of the organization, which basically covered all the representatives across the organization hierarchy. Now, to engage into that conversation, as I mentioned earlier, that that English is a secondary language; it is not the primary language. Um, and to really uncover the reality, we used something known as metaphor language. So in India, films are quite popular, especially in the southern part of, I would not say it's especially, but across India, Bollywood is a big thing. So we asked them questions around to describe their experiences using maybe movie titles, with some very generic words, some metaphors, because we wanted to also understand relationships. And through the use of metaphors and some easily, some common shared language like movies, uh, we were able to collect the data. Now, this data was then viewed from different lenses such as transactional analysis, which is Eric Byrne's work. Now, TA is known for it's a communication theory, which looks at relationships, internal relationships, and it looks at power dynamics, which start from our childhood, that is between parent and child. We also used Hofstede's cultural indices so that we get an idea about the data which is collected, what does it actually mean in an Indian context. Hofstede's cultural indices looks at variables like power distance, masculine, feminine, and it is also contextualized to specific countries. So these were the two paradigms that we used, transactional analysis and cultural indices. And another lens that we used was viable system model. And this is where the innovation came in. When we looked at the data with these three lenses, what we really found out was, Sujay, if I can request you to, move the slide. Yeah. So some of the outcomes that we found out was there was a clear power difference. So it was not a question of incapable managers, but because of power imbalance, managers were not really able to express their challenges to the hierarchy. So that was the first problem which was identified, which was also leading to power asymmetries. Because of silence of managers, and what we like to call it as verbal compliance, wherein nobody spoke when decisions was being taken, there were more of whitewashing of decision making which was happening. And we also mapped it using the viable system model, wherein we found that certain systems were mixed up. And I think we will see that as we progress in this conversation. As a result of that, when we presented the outcomes in form of structure and power, the impact was those in the position of power, as I said, they were the ones who engaged us. They actually saw how structures actually, or the organization design was actually influencing individual behaviors. So instead of trying to change the individuals, changes were made to bring in power symmetry, wherein individuals with similar power parity were made to have conversation. And most importantly, another thing which happened was there were very targeted coaching and mentoring which happened instead of a very broad level leadership programs. In India, it is, or across, in various organizations, it is seen that leadership programs are are conducted at a very broad level and are conducted at over a period of time, which may result, which take time to show results. And over here, what happened was, instead of getting into very broad leadership programs, it was very targeted coaching with reference to how to talk to the client were taken up. Yeah. So this is about the whole power dynamics with reference to when a consultant basically starts engaging with the client or wherever there is a power difference. Now, one of the things which is also critical to note is that a consultant, when she or they engage in an organization, the power dynamics are not just seen externally. They are also felt internally. So when I'm talking about internal felt power dynamics, these come from more or less socio-cultural identities. Like right now, when I'm talking in front of these members, I'm very much aware of my identity of a woman coming from India. And that is somewhere playing up in the subconscious. So these internal oppressor-oppressed logic is not just something which is seen in between the consultant and the client, but it is also something which is experienced internally by the consultant. So before even going ahead and getting into the whole process of really speaking truth to the power, it's also equally critical to understand and acknowledge the internal oppressor-oppressed dialogues which take place. So I would like to also share here, Sujay, I think my mandala is missing. If you can just click. Yes. Just would like to share one of how I have been able to navigate the internal power dynamics is through the use of art and somatic practices. As I said, we also have internal oppressed and oppressor. We are byproducts of modernism, wherein analytical thinking and mind, thanks to René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, overpowers everything else. So if we are to really understand this inner dynamics, it requires us to move beyond the concepts, the labels, and requires us to really take a pause and connect with a silent yet a not so silent voice which is residing within our body. And this is my expression of what it means to really navigate through internal dynamics. And this is a mandala which I had made. And the journey is right there, where it starts from not being aware of any oppression internally to getting in touch with anger, moving towards grief, and eventually realizing that there is an agency within. And then that itself moves towards what we call as faith, and then moves towards co-creation. So this is how it looks in practice at two fronts. One is with the client and one is inside the change agent. With this, I'll just take a pause and hand over to Sujay to take it forward.
Thanks, Ushma. Okay, I think Ushma, we will, like we decided, move forward with the VSM illustration. Okay, I think that we're close to our allocated time, but there may be time to look at this briefly, and we can take questions also based on the case study. I wanted to also present the same case study from the point of view of a VSM practitioner, because the way we worked together was Ushma largely worked with people, facilitating people on the ground, whereas I was more concerned with problem structuring and modeling. The background to the VSM case study that Ushma spoke about was the reason that the VSM even was in the discussion here was because the project sponsor was already familiar with the VSM. So that was the one of the most important reason why the VSM why an exploration was possible. However, the initial explorations ended up being largely prescriptive, because we were all grappling with the VSM initially, and the communication of the VSM to other people is not very easy, and it met with limited success. Although operationally, several first-order elements of the VSM were in use. In the months that went by, some of the perceived challenges were, like we mentioned before, incapable managers, communication gaps, and stagnant growth. But the next iteration of the VSM was actually focused on broadening the view using the enterprise complexity approach. On the right side here is how the problem was presented by the main sponsor, and this is the organization, which is the client's organization, their operations, and the third level of recursion is a local unit which is distributed geographically. So the problem was seen in the operations or even in the management of the local units, and competence was seen to be lacking here. There was a complete non-existence of an audit, an internal audit mechanism. There was a principal because it was it was a network of multiple organizations. The principal organization was seen as an external entity, and their efforts at monitoring was seen as an intrusion. So by reframing this using the ECM, a different view of the organization was possible. So what's in blue is the principal, is the network controller, which we can call the principal, and there is a power equation here. Power is more in the favor of the principal than in the partner, because the partner is one amongst many such partners, and this client organization was our client. So in reality, the organization of the client's organization was actually a composite organization. It had the meta system, for example, was constituted by members from both the principal and the partner. This was how it was tacitly operating. And the monitoring was actually a function carried out by the principal. And here, the narrative analysis that Ushma performed was particularly of value here because the differences, the power imbalances between people who are working in the cities, English language educated, were here located in the system 3 of the organization, whereas the more vernacular-based workers were in regional centers, and there was a power distance here. There was also, difficulty in dealing with the external entity as it was perceived, the principal, simply because the roles of the cooperation between the partner and the principal in strategic and policy making was not clear. So the way to structurally manage this was seen as increasing representation in the higher level of recursion, which is the composite organization in which our client was a system 1. So our client had to increase representation in the meta system in order for a common language to evolve, which was non-threatening to internal monitoring and accountability activities. So it was an understanding that there is a power imbalance between city and non-city workers, and there's some targeted interventions that were possible there. B, the recognition that the meta-systemic roles that had to be played in order for this to be viable. So they had to operate at the higher metasystemic level as well. And some of that common language eased some of the relational problems that were perceived at the level of the client organization. So this is in summary, the insights on power that we got through the narrative analysis shaped how structural changes or political maneuvers might have to be created. So that is the summary of what we did, and the results were far better than the first iterations of the VSM, which were largely based on the first order approach to the organization. Right. So I'd like to end with where do we see ourselves operating? So we see currently two venues of operation. One is the discipline of organizational development, which Ushma has already spoken about. The reason we're looking at this is because OD, especially in the Indian context, is already an accepted or a practiced discipline. And many of the values of the ideas in this presentation are also embodied in the OD practice, such as internal transformation. It is also something that recognizes the importance of a sponsor. So this way of dialoguing with the elite is also very much aligned to this. And our endeavor here is to move away from deposit models of knowledge and deposit models of teaching or training, and the disproportionate focus on individual change, and move towards incorporating cybernetic and systemic and critical perspectives into OD practice, and try to foreground structure and agency, especially related to indigenous perspectives. This is one venue. Another venue, which I'm working with another person, Sheshadri, from the organization Forestry for All Foundation, is to look at indigenous ethnobotanical practices in our state, in India, in South India, Karnataka. The context is as follows. Karnataka is a state with multiple bio-geo regions. So there are rainforests, deciduous forests, grasslands, mangroves, coastal areas, and all of these also equally have traditional communities that have co-evolved with the landscape. So there is a rich ethnobotanical indigenous knowledge in several of these communities, but this knowledge is also fast depleting as the children of native custodians, as they move to cities, they migrate to cities to take on urban jobs. And the other challenge is that the social relations in these areas are still rigid, they're still old-fashioned, and there's a variety of traditional groups operating, and the dynamics are very tricky. So this is the context of the place. There are a number of purposes and intentions at operational here. For example, mainstream science, including climate science, or agricultural science, including agricultural institutions, they are concerned about enhancing biodiversity for agricultural and climate reasons. Somebody like us from the critical organizational praxis, we are interested in preserving indigenous knowledge and recognizing native custodians and providing sustainable and local livelihoods. The youth may be more interested in migrating. They are interested in social mobility, especially those from disadvantaged groups. The dominant groups are interested in accumulating wealth, and the industry politics nexus is interested in gaining more and more control over resources and degrading the land in the process. So this is the reality of the landscape of where we're trying to apply these ideas. And our approach is very modest and very pragmatic. We want to start with the smallest possible to first start with some for-profit tangible services related to biodiversity enhancement, typically working with private landowners, and slowly try to include traditional communities simply because of shared knowledge and the requirement of ecological and biodiversity knowledge for these private farmlands. And in the process, we want to improve communications and try to evolve some sort of emancipatory language amongst indigenous communities and set in motion, networks of communication. So this is, this is the end of the presentation, and this is, currently what we're engaged with. So this is where we are. Thank you very much, and I hope we were able to make some sense, and we are open for questions.
Thank you very much for a really exciting presentation. I am pretty sure that there are lots of questions in all of us. So if you want, you can stop sharing, and then we can engage with people. So who would like to start with questions? Judith, do you want to start? And you are just applauding.
I was just applauding, and I'm learning, and really, I just want to listen. I'm learning a lot. I have no question right now. Thank you.
Okay, Marta has a question.
Yes, thank you. I would like to really ask, because here I'm based here in Colombia, South America, and I'm sure that what you have presented today, which is so interesting and so very much connected to what we are thinking here, which is really from the civil society, getting us all together to find these ways of organizing together. And it's been the biggest problem we've had. We also know that we need technologies to do that, and that's a very, very important thing on that, and that's what we've been very much on that side also. And of course about governance, because when we think about this common place where we will share these platforms, so yes, we need to talk all about these things. And for me today, there has been a lot of very nice insights. And I would really want to know if we can have some kind of meeting to just to let you know or what we're in and see if we can, what we need to do in order to get some share of what you're thinking and what we are already kind of thinking, but we need have this, we share the same whys, we share a lot of things. And I have just one question at this moment. One is getting kind of contact, and I'm sure that Angela, we can do it through Metaforum and all the things. But it's really yes, getting to know how can we learn more about you and having that contact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha. Definitely, I mean, I would be very happy to have a conversation. I really hope we can take it forward and discuss more, because I'm sure that there's a lot of commonality in civil society challenges across the world. And it'd be wonderful to talk to you.
And I have another question. Excuse me, because yes, I noted here, and please excuse me. When you said you talked about the endeavors, you said move, focus away from deposit models and individual change. And my question is, why moving away from individual change when this is one of our focus, which is everything comes from individual kind of be critic about himself, and of course doing the necessary changes and be consciousness that we have been dominated by another way of thinking, and the way of thinking which cares of life is really should come from the individuals.
Right. Yeah. So our approach to the individual change is that the individual change that we were talking about was the individual change expected by another person. It is we are interested in emancipatory change, where obviously we are interested in self-development of individuals. But what we refer to was when change is expected in somebody by somebody else from a position of power, and they dictate that this is how somebody must change. And that is a prescriptive way of looking at people and trying to organize people that we are pointing out, and we want to point out that is a common practice which people should look at and say that there is something wrong with that. The other aspect to individual change is, I think, also is I've been seeing this narrative in India. There is a lot of I think there is a tendency to take on a lot of responsibility on the self. So often in sustainability discussions, people end up with after a whole lot of discussion, they come down to the thing of what must I do as an individual, which is great, but without the requisite structure, without a structure that supports individual activity, there is only so much that an individual can do. So I think that is basically what we're trying to say.
Thank you, Marta. John has a question. John?
Yeah, first of all, thank you ever so much. Really interesting talk, and I just love all the work you're doing. It reflects a lot on the work that Andrew and I have done, and I was particularly interested in your comment on experts. And one of the problems we had when we were working in an eco-village where we attempted to train everybody in the viable system model is that a number of people got it very quickly and rapidly and quite deeply, and they were accused of becoming a priesthood. So whenever a topic came up, somebody would say, oh, well, we should do this. And somebody say, no, the VSM says we should do this. And there was a real sense that we were actually creating a problem that we were trying to get rid of, which was to make the place more equitable. So I wondered if you've had any experiences like that. But I have a number of questions, but the main one is you talk a lot about power asymmetries. And the question is how you deal with that, because it's a really fundamental issue that if you do have these power asymmetries, it's almost impossible to restructure and get people to think in a different way so that you can actually see the VSM actually starting to work in the way that Stafford thought it should work.
Yes, I mean, I can. When sometimes I mean, I totally agree that this has been our experience as well. I mean, working with when there is a lot of power asymmetry is sometimes hopeless, but I think that there are times when it is hopeless and the system has changed and people have left and opted out of a certain oppressive scenario. But very rarely do we see that. We see that there are sometimes the diversity that exists is an automatic safeguard against extreme autocracy, and sometimes we seem to see that because sometimes even though a rigid social structure exists, that rigid social structure has so many diverse groups that kind of somehow maintains and safeguards against extreme actions. So, but at the same time, I think that different ways of being exist, and many people in a smaller context seem to be very well integrated into those ways of being. So to talk about like the Church of VSM sort of a situation that you're talking about. I don't know. We've seen rarely a scenario like that because often it is hard to communicate an abstract concept because of two reasons. One is something like the VSM, at least at this point of time in history, has to come through the English language, and that constitutes the first problem. The second problem is that the sophistication in the language of the VSM, although at the core of it, some concepts are very universal, unless their language is co-created by a different group, they are not going to really engage with the concepts which are already, which have in an epistemological tradition have already reached a certain level of sophistication. So it's very difficult for two reasons. So that's mainly what we've seen. So there's a lot of resistance to an abstract concept is typically what our experience has been.
Okay, and I guess in that context, you haven't used the word autonomy, I think, at all in your whole talk, whereas the VSM for me is basically all about autonomy and cohesion I mean, it's this step away from authority and obedience to autonomy and cohesion. And for me, that's very much a foot in the door, that you can establish that concept quite straightforwardly. And if you're always talking about autonomy, it moves the conversation forward very rapidly.
Yes, I think that that's what we mean by when we talk about agency and emancipation. I think we are indeed talking about autonomy, but I think that autonomy, from a VSM point of view, I think also implies a certain structural sophistication for the autonomy to exist. But we are talking at a more fundamental level of agency, and the fundamental idea here is that a group of people who are acquainted with the VSM can all agree on a certain structure that is requisite for, say, autonomy in a certain social context, context of intervention. But that view is not shared by anybody else except by those cyberneticians. And in India, or in the global south, or maybe even anywhere, that group of cyberneticians is a very small group. So it's a very small group that all agree on what the best way to approach something is, but then nobody else speaks that language. So the idea of the critical praxis is to create dialogue between the group of cyberneticians and the groups of people with other ways of understanding things, who may have totally different distinctions that they've drawn out in their performative environment. Yet, because we're all human, there are certain things that are common, and can we arrive at a language that simplifies the interactions between these people who all are quite convinced by their own models through which they view the world? I mean, that's the essence of what we're trying to say. So while we intervene in a system, and the reference paradigm for us is the VSM, and we are trying to look at, okay, how cybernetically sound are the interventions we are doing, but we can't really communicate with that cybernetic language to a broader set of stakeholders, many of who may not even speak the same language, in terms of may not speak English at all, may have a totally different way of relating to people and the world. And how do you now communicate there is in a sense what we're trying to understand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jonan.
Thank you very much.
We have 3 people and now 4 with Raul waiting for questions. So first one is David.
Hi, David. David, hi.
Hi, Sujay. Well, I'm very impressed. I feel that so much dialogue in organisational efficiency glosses over the mixture of interests and the attempt to get everybody collaborating in a set of interests which are not exactly the same for everybody. I loved Thomas Sass's line in The Jungle, which is probably denigrating the jungle. It's eat or be eaten. In the human world, it's define or be defined. And the problem is people pursue not merely their self-interests, but their perceived self-interests. For example, is it more in one's self-interest to have a great deal of social capital or financial capital? And the answer to that question varies in a mass of things. Obviously, I appreciate your approach of not scaring the horses or not scaring the people, perhaps at the top of the system, whom you are trying to help. More inclusive pay off tremendously well for everybody, at least some of the time in some situations. I like Paul Getty, one of the first dollar billionaires, saying, I need people to be rich enough to be able to afford cars so that they can buy my petrol so I can be a billionaire. I'm interested in our awareness of these dialogues. I mean, clearly, I suppose VSM can be translated into various South Asian languages perfectly well. And I suppose that among the diversity of South Asian philosophies, there is going to be stuff which can join with that, which can either be used to support that philosophy or to encourage people who identify with a particular philosophy or ethnic identity or whatever, to see this as something which they can do rather than being a sort of, I don't know, London centric or whatever thing. I'm interested in how you are successfully addressing the dynamics of both self-interest and misperceived self-interest. How far it's very easy to, I mean, we're all in favour of equality until we're hungry and somebody is richer than us and we're willing to sort of steal their bread at the very least and overcome property laws. The dynamics of morality through evolutionary psychology, so that we all contain within us mixtures of sort of urge for status, urge for equality, urge for cooperation. But yeah, we are the cooperators who have ethnically cleansed the planet of other large mammals and Homo habilis and presumably the Neanderthals and so on. So there are, I think you are addressing the most important issues and the most difficult issues, and I'm very interested in the fine details of how you're actually succeeding in doing this. And obviously, what we see highlighted in the sort of colonialist, post-colonialist situation is there in organizations or entities identifying themselves as nations or whatever. And I mean, this notion of identity is a great thing. It allows you to pick a stereotype of a certain group and say, I am that, I'm a true Scotsman or whatever. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm interested in the fine detail of the dynamics. I mean, I like Robinson and Acemoglu's thing about how nations fail, which basically says that you're vulnerable to external attack and expropriation if you don't have a degree of relative equality within your nation, so that the Dalits will sort of fight for your elite rather than the East India Company's elite and that sort of thing. Yeah. So how have you managed so well so far? What are you doing?
Well, I'm afraid I don't have too much to add, although I agree with your viewpoint. I think that we are pretty much grappling with the same issues, same kind of problems. With respect to translating the VSM, again, my perspective is that the translation must come from a space of problematization. It is those who are grappling with the problem and must create the words that are relevant to them. And it is through such a process that a South Asian translation of the VSM must happen, and not from a top-down manner of which can end up becoming a transliteration. So I think that the translation of the VSM may be more distributed in that sense. But I think that a lot of people grappling with problems at the ground may not require the sophistication of a VSM in their day-to-day lives. They might require to appreciate the slightly global or slightly more larger implications of their own activities, which Pickering calls poetic activities. Now, an appreciation of how that plays out in a larger space is what emancipation or facilitating somebody on the route to emancipation is all about. So, in that sense, the effort lies in opening up dialogue and trying to create a space for new words and new metaphors that are not automatically degrading to a community or to a group's purposes. And it's a it's a discovery that every stakeholder must do within that space. So, so I'm afraid the answer is not a straightforward one.
Yeah, but the variety of South Indian philosophies and ways of operating, there's got to be excellent stuff there to be mined, which hasn't been mined in the sort of Westernish dialogue, which hits us full frontally at the moment.
Yeah, I think that there have been several people in the who have flirted with various Eastern ideas, very I think very useful manner. I mean, from Carl Jung to Pickering to Spencer Brown, laws of form. They all talk about some of the very fundamental concepts of Wu Wei or Yin and Yang and the Tao and things like that.
Even 19th century symbolic logic that some people have traced pathways across, haven't they?
Right.
From earlier Indian philosophers. Sorry.
Yes, I mean I agree. I really don't think I have too much to offer in terms of the details at this point. And we are working. We are going through experiences with people who are in, especially in the the fringe of forested areas and who still retain cultures that are very different from mainstream cultures and.
Maybe I'll try answering that a little bit more from an individual perspective at a how level. Like one of the characteristic of a collectivist culture is the reliance on the word and. So it's not either or, as Sujay also mentioned, it is yin and yang. So it's about literally stepping aside and seeing all the identities and the variety and possibly holding the tension of the coexistence and letting something new emerge. As Sujay also mentioned, that it's about new words, new language. And anything new to be created requires both polarities to coexist. So possibly that is what I'll just offer a little bit of glimpse from the how perspective on the detailing. The entire unfolding might be different for different individuals, but this can be a little bit of heuristic of just possibly appending the word and into the identities and taking it forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ushma. And thank you, Sujay and David. And we have Marcus now and then Raul.
I just want to thank you for the very, very clear presentation, Sujay and Ushma. The only perhaps point I would like you to explore a little bit more, because it's connected to my personal work, and that is the idea of enterprise complexity model. How is it that you relate the client organization to the composite organization through the enterprise complexity model? And at the same time, I would like some clarification from your own part about the dissimilarities in variety between the different parts of, connected to a problem situation. So if you have a particular problem situation, like transforming an organization or moving an organization from a position of stability to one of change, how is it that you produce this balancing of varieties in a sort of methodological sense? So please help me, clarify me these two things: enterprise complexity model and the similar varieties in the parts interacting in the situation.
Right. Maybe I'll answer the enterprise complexity model question first. Our experience with the enterprise complexity model has been related to the case study that we spoke about. So the standard application of the VSM, looking at a single organization, was extremely tricky because it was not possible to understand the factors that were affecting the organization beyond what was concerning the business process. So the only way to really understand this organizational setup, which had several things which were non-standard. For example, there was a slightly asymmetric relationship between a principal and a number of partners. While one would expect that there were some normative actions which would help everybody, align better, there were on the other, to the contrary, there were a lot of confusing signaling, and it was not a very easy situation to understand. And the only way to make sense of the situation actually was the enterprise complexity model, because only when we looked at the entirety of the network of multiple partners behaving, interacting with a principal, and trying to perform in a, let's say, a global supply chain, then the parts started to fit together, and it was quite clear where the variety imbalances were. There were clearly, gaps in communication. But the implementation of that, or moving the system to a better state, has had its own set of challenges, because the nature of the asymmetric relationship was also that the partners found it very difficult to get a seat at the table. So to even communicate some of these ideas in as simplified form as possible was also very, very difficult. So it was a gradual process of maneuvering, but the enterprise complexity model, in fact, did help to understand the situation, which was not a very straightforward situation to begin with. So that was actually the use of the enterprise complexity model. In a non-formal context, when it comes to communities, this is a problem that I'm still struggling with. So I don't have a good answer of what is a successful strategy to, say, handle the varieties of different groups of people in a certain problem context, especially when you want to have a participatory method of discussing the problem. So I would simply say that I don't have sufficient experience in that domain to be able to, offer a good answer.
Thank you, Sujay.
Thank you, Sujay and Raul. Marcus.
Yes, colleagues, I think you have raised a few, many very important issues. Communication with this dialogue with the indigenous, or collaboration, emancipation, and the symmetry of power, etc. Now, I could raise several issues, but I will limit myself to one only. You are framing an organization as a system of oppressors and oppressed. And that's a way to do it. And you are addressing here an antagonism which can be very important, but it's not the exclusive one. But what I'm really missing here is that you should have other ways, other pairs, which are more synergetic, not antagonistic, but synergetic. So, for example, there is a supporter and there's a supported. And actually, this is very good because it's vice versa. It's not like in the oppressor and oppressed, where the oppressed cannot do anything because the other one is so overpowering him. Now, here, I am the supporter and I support her. And she is a supporter and she supports me. It's all loops. And I don't see this in your presentation. Also, in this relationship, Ushma, you have equated power and authorship. And these are two things, author it comes from the Latin auctor, is someone who foments someone, who supports him, who enhances him, helps him to enable himself, and so on. And so it's a different thing. Power has a legitimate power and illegitimate power. And so I think it's wrong to denigrate the concept of authorship as a whole. So, well, would have more things, but I leave it at that.
Thank you, Marcus. Sujay, Ushma.
Yeah, Ushma, do you have something to say?
Yes, in fact, it brought out a very recent conversation that I had with one of my clients, wherein the conversation was, I was trying to say that the language ultimately shapes the experience. And the language which was coming up was very problem, let's identify the problem and let's solve the problem. And it is a proprietor-owned organization, so the openness towards new things is a little less. Yet at the same time, there is a lot of sensitivity around how do you drive change. And one of the ways that I recommended is, why don't we change the language to what you recommended, support and supporting, instead of looking at trying to solve a problem. Let's look at what's working well and let's work towards enhancing it well. But that itself was shot down because the language that the client system was really comfortable was problem and problem solving. So sometimes it also requires one to take a little backseat and say, okay, we will eventually go there. As I said, it's about holding the tensions while the client is not willing to really, is anxious about bringing in some change and yet not very aware of the impact of the language which comes up. So while you were mentioning this, Marcus, and thank you for bringing it up, this was something which came up. It also depends on the appetite of the client which is there. So that's what I would like to share from my experience on this.
May I add something? Thank you very much, Ushma. I mean, we are in such a difficult time with all the crises everywhere. And I have gathered a lot of experiences over all these decades, also as a consultant, as a teacher and all that. And I see that we have, when we diagnose something, there is an emphasis on that which is bad, which is weakness, which is threats and so on. And the other side is totally forgotten. So I read diagnoses where I only have the bad aspects, but I should also write what is bad. But I should also write, we should have more of something good.
Yes.
So where are we going? And I think that's very important. Not only look at the downside, but look at the upside. It's so simple, but we always forget about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just reading about this, that as humans, we are not wired to look at the abundance. The wiring itself is about survival. So that is where also the tension comes in. But yeah, thanks for that note, definitely taken. Yeah.
Just to add a
so
small...
Marcus moving down, so I was like a little confused just trying to find you. Okay. Yeah.
I'd just like to add something to that, Marcus. I think the intention behind showing the power imbalances within the organization system was a part of the diagnosis of what might be contributing to the problems that were experienced. It is not to say that there were not things that were going well. I mean, there were several loops that were running quite well. So, but the intention here was to show how the viable system model can be used as a paradigm on which you can juxtapose an idea of a power relationship, so that you can understand which are the relationships that are facing a certain kind of strain. So you can alleviate the experience of the actors in those who are executing those roles and those relationships. so it is. I mean, that was the point that that was our intention to communicate. I mean, the larger case study obviously has aspects where there are stronger loops within the equation. For example, the service delivery loop was something that was exceptionally strong in that particular case study.
Well, thank you very much. I agree with you, Sujay. I just caught myself recently when we did a big analysis, and the team, focused on what was missing, and we should have looked at the possibilities, at the perspective, at the opportunities. We should have put that in the diagnosis to say, well, this has to be enhanced, fomented, and so on. So that's just all I wanted to say.
Yeah. I like the sentiment, and I will definitely think about it again. I mean, it's the sentiment that I think that is very valid.
Thank you, Marcus, for a really interesting conversation, and Ushma and Sujay. We have 3 final questions, so 4, and then we will close the session. We are already running late, but as you can see, still a lot of interest. So if for those of you that can stay for another 5 minutes, let's see, Bihaya.
Hey, hi, Ushma and Sujay. That was a great presentation. I'm new to this field, so I'm just getting into VSM and trying to understand it. I mean, I'm the very beginning of my journey. The question I have is, I wanted to understand this a little bit more from you. So you talked about in the very beginning of the presentation the loss of indigenous methods, ways of working, etc. And in your case study, so you use the VSM as a model for diagnosis and intervention, and you made certain structural changes instead of training for individual behavior change. So you rather decided to do it through structural changes. So my question is, so when you were working with the people in the organizations, the rural area, so did you have any discovery about, or were there any conversations about any of their indigenous methods which they would have liked to bring as part of the structural change? Because I think ultimately it was the consultant's decision to use the VSM, right? Because others normally they don't understand this model at all. The language is very different. So were there any intentions? Were there any discovery sessions where the participants from these rural areas could be invited, and did they have any suggestions about how they would want to work or what changes they would want to have?
Thank you, Vijaya. I think I'd like to answer that in 2 parts. Firstly, I think the point that the VSM is something that may not be widely digested in a certain interventional context is actually one of the points that we tried to make in the presentation. So in that, we completely agree with you. And I think that the choice of the VSM was also because the main project sponsor was acquainted with the VSM, and it was through a number of discussions, we were very comfortable with using the VSM as a language. So it was a group of 2 or 3 people who started this conversation about the VSM, and it made sense because it was a shared language between these 2 or 3 people who were thinking about the organization, including at that point of time, including me as a consultant. But what we discovered through the process of trying to diagnose and then trying to design the organization using the VSM was that there was a huge gap that we were not able to bridge. That the intuitive understanding of the VSM resided only with very few people, 2 or 3 people, who were engaging with iterative models on a very regular basis, but it was lost to a major part of the organization. So we realized initially after the initial training sessions and all that, it may not be worth trying to, to continue sustained training on these concepts and these ideas, because the people who were working at various levels, mid-management or lower, had different concerns, and they were actively working, and their innovation lay in a different domain. So, in fact, many of the people working in the semi-rural or the tier 2, tier 3 town context, there was a lot of innovation that was happening there. So the work processes largely, there was a lot of innovation happening on the ground. The problems were in communicating that, or being able to sit, as an equal at a discussion table along with people from other, other departments or other people who are perceived as having a higher level of power. So these were some of the issues, but the innovation was there at the ground level, and this was something that was recognized by the management, because without that sort of a innovation, it would not survive, because it was fairly large organization. So that was with respect to the case study. So I just want to be clear, because I'm not talking about the rural work with respect to the ecological work. I mean, that's a different. So with respect to the case study we presented, this is what I wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Sujay and Vijaya. I have one question, and then Judith will have the last question. My question is very broad. I have been for the last 20 years working with the VSM as a consultant and as an educator, and I've been very curious about many of the critiques, in particular that critical system thinkers have done about the VSM. And I have understood the VSM from a very different perspective, that is not a perspective of sort of a theory that is there to improve organizational performance at the expense of whatever workers' interests or whatever, but the opposite. And I think that Stafford, over his life, and in particular after Chile, really changed his perspective of the VSM as a much more social tool to generate democracy and equality and so on. So I am convinced, I've always been convinced, that it is possible to use the VSM from a perspective of emancipation. And actually, in Metaforum in 2023, the whole conference was about viability as the hidden agenda for viability as emancipation. So what is your perspective about that? Do you agree? I mean, in your practice, do you think that really the fundamental VSM theory could be used as a tool for emancipation?
I again like to answer that in multiple, I think, parts. Firstly, I think personally, I do use the VSM quite a lot. So I think it has been a very valuable tool for me. In fact, I started using the VSM first to model myself as a professional, and that was my first experiment with the VSM. And I tried to create a viable system model of myself as a person interacting in a professional environment. And then I started. I was not satisfied with that, and then it became more and more complex, and so on. But so I do find that it's a very, very powerful way of looking at things, and to the extent that after a point of time it becomes kind of intuitive to look at things as as system 4 or system 1 and so on. However, I think that depending on the interventional space, I think the way the VSM is used must change. I think, for example, let us say there is a group of people who are all speaking the same language, let's say English. And let's say that they have a certain capacity to engage with a certain level of abstraction, and then VSM becomes a very powerful tool. But if it's a broader set of stakeholders, and the opportunities for interaction on the lines of talking about with the VSM as a paradigm becomes increasingly difficult, then I think it becomes slightly impractical to look at the VSM as the main paradigm. So the VSM can be a paradigm that it's like, it's like a gathering stone, like a rolling stone that gathers more moss. I mean, that's what you want to do. Over a period of time, you want to build consensus around VSM-based understanding in a certain situation. But there is no guarantee that all stakeholders will ever subscribe to a certain paradigm. But then how do you still manage to have good outcomes for all stakeholders, even though most of them may not grapple with the VSM, or they may not even engage with it in any sense. So this is the kind of problem context that we are really concerned with, because we find more of this in India. So that is that's basically what's motivated us to think on these lines.
Yeah, well, I can sympathize very much with what you are saying, and my own experience, because I've been trying to expand the application of the VSM in context, very complex social context. And in particular, I've tried to use the VSM, for instance, also in indigenous communities in the Amazon jungle, and in very extremely poor communities in the Afro-Caribbean descendants in the Caribbean, in Colombia, in extremely poor communities where narco traffickers and drug traffickers and guerrillas have been fighting in communities in Colombia, because I do believe I will disagree with you in the sense that VSM shouldn't be the main, let's say, context to deal with these kind of interventions. What I think is that VSM can be easily combined with other systemic approaches in which that could facilitate this kind of very complex dialogue that can help to enable a conversation without imposing the VSM jargon, because the main issue is that the jargon is is very difficult for people that don't share the English, don't share the scientific background and whatever. So I think that one of the main challenges that we have in this community precisely is to come to the heart of the values and the heart of the criteria that the VSM offers, and learn how to use it in a context in which we can facilitate a dialogue within this philosophy, with these values, without imposing the jargon or the technological expertise, so that we cannot, we can really engage a larger kind of communities, especially in the global south. So anyway, lots to learn together, and thank you very much. Last comment from Judith, and we will finish.
It feels sort of obsolete now. Thank you. I think it's okay. I don't have any further contributions. Just thanks a lot for today. It was really, you opened a blind spot for me. Yeah. So
thank you very much, Judith. Well, Sujay and Ushma, absolutely delighted conversation. Thank you very much. I will be contacting you again, because I think that there is lots of things that we can continue doing together, and we are very lucky to have you joining our community in the Metaforum. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. The feeling is mutual, and I'm afraid there are lots of questions on the chat. I'm not sure whether they're going to be lost when we close the meeting, but I don't think it's possible to respond to the chat.
I have the chat recording, so anyone who wants it, just write to me and I'll send it to you, and we will upload the recording in the YouTube channel. I think that it is possible, but I'm not completely sure, to share the chat recordings as well. I've never done it, but please write to me and I'll share the chat. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. Okay. We are indeed very grateful.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Thank you so
much. In a month time, okay?
Thank you.
Oh, and Angela, there's Miriam has asked how she gets on the mailing list. So I've asked to send my email. If anybody else wants to do that, can you sign up through the website now?
Yes, you can. You can just go to the Metaforum website. You can sign. There is a sign-in button, and you can sign in, and your email will be registered, so you will be receiving the updates about the conference and the webinars.
Yeah, sorry about the slight confusion about starting at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, but you can get the recording.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Okay, and a really great seminar today. Really enjoyed it.
Yep. Thank you very much. Lovely.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Next
and hello, Russell. Haven't seen you for months.
Hi, John. I was going to ask a question, but I can't work out where the hand thing is, so I just...
You can always just shout.
Yeah.